No one told the new Omega healer which patient to avoid. She healed the Alpha King first. The scream came first, then the smell of blood. Elira ran down the stone corridor with her healing bag pressed against her chest, her sandals slapping against cold marble. She had arrived at the Royal Healing House only 3 hours ago. No one had shown her around. No one had given her a map of the halls, a list of names, or a single warning about where she was and was not allowed to go. She had been told only one thing, by the tired clerk at the front gate. There is a man dying in the West Wing, and every healer on duty tonight is already busy. So she ran. She turned a corner and saw 2 guards standing frozen outside a heavy wooden door, their faces pale, their hands shaking on the hilts of their swords. Neither of them moved to stop her. Later she would understand why. In that moment, all she saw was a closed door with muffled groaning coming from behind it, and she did not have time to knock. She pushed the door open. The room inside was dim, lit only by a few oil lamps that flickered against the stone walls. A man lay on a wide bed, his shirt torn open, blood soaking through bandages that had clearly been applied in a hurry by someone who did not know what they were doing. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his breathing came in short, ragged pulls. Elira did not see a crown. She did not see silk sheets or gold trim on the furniture. She saw a person who was minutes from death. "Move," she said to the single attendant, standing uselessly by the bedside, a young man who looked more frightened than helpful. He stepped back without argument, too stunned by her sudden arrival to ask who she was. Elira dropped to her knees beside the bed and tore away the old bandages. The wound beneath was deep, cutting across his side, just below his ribs, and it had been made by something sharp and deliberate. She recognized the pattern instantly. It was not an accident. Someone had tried very hard to make sure this man did not survive the night. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small clay jar filled with pale green paste, one of the few remedies she had prepared herself before leaving her training house. Her hands did not shake. This was the one thing she knew how to do without fear. Healing had always come naturally to her, a steady calm settling over her mind the moment she touched broken skin. She pressed her palms against the wound, closed her eyes, and let her energy flow the way her teachers had shown her 100 times. Warmth spread from her fingers into the torn flesh, knitting threads of skin and muscle back together thread by thread. The man on the bed let out a low groan, his back arching slightly from the shock of the healing energy entering his body, and then his breathing began to slow into something steadier. Elira kept working for nearly an hour. Sweat gathered at her temples. Her arms trembled with effort, but she did not stop, because stopping halfway through a healing this deep could do more damage than leaving the wound alone. She had learned that lesson early, from a teacher who had lost a patient by pulling away too soon. When she finally lifted her hands, the wound had closed into a thin pink line instead of an open gash. The man's chest rose and fell in a slow, even rhythm. His face, which had been the color of ash when she entered the room, now held a faint warmth beneath the skin. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard, and only then did she look around the room properly. The attendant was staring at her as though she had grown a second head. The 2 guards from outside had crept into the doorway, their swords still in their sheaths, their eyes wide with something that looked like fear rather than relief. No one said thank you. No one said anything at all. "He needs rest," Elira said, wiping her hands on a cloth from her bag. "Keep him warm. Bring broth when he wakes, nothing heavy. I'll check on him again in the morning." Still no one spoke. She frowned, gathering her things, confused by the silence. In her training house, healers were praised the moment they saved a life, sometimes embarrassingly so, with older healers clapping and younger ones cheering. Here, the room felt like a held breath, like everyone was waiting for something terrible to happen. "Is something wrong?" she finally asked, looking at the attendant. The young man opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. Do you know who that is?" Elira glanced at the sleeping man. Even at rest, his features were sharp and commanding, his jaw strong, his dark hair damp with sweat against the pillow. He looked important, certainly, wealthy even, judging by the fine stitching on his ruined shirt. But important people got hurt too. Important people needed healing just like anyone else. "No," she admitted. "Should I?" The attendant's face went even paler than before, if that was possible. One of the guards in the doorway made a strange choking sound, as if he were trying not to laugh or cry, and could not decide which. That, the attendant said slowly, is the Alpha King. Elira's hands froze mid-motion over her bag. For a moment, the words did not fully land. She had heard, of course, that the king had been attacked days ago somewhere outside the palace grounds, wounded badly enough that rumors said he might not survive. Everyone in the city had heard that story, whispered in markets and taverns, though no one seemed to know the details. She had not connected that story to the man bleeding on this bed, because no one had told her he was being kept here, in this wing, behind this door. No one told me, she said quietly, almost to herself. No one was supposed to come in here, the attendant said, his voice shaking now. Only the head healer is allowed to treat him. Only someone approved by the council. There are rules about who is allowed near him, especially since... He stopped himself, glancing nervously at the guards. Especially since what? Elira asked. Neither guard answered. The attendant looked away. Elira stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. Though whether from the effort of healing, or the weight of what she had just learned, she could not tell. She looked down at the king, sleeping peacefully now because of her hands, because of paste she had mixed herself in a small clay jar, because she had walked into a room she was never supposed to enter. I didn't know, she repeated, quieter this time. It doesn't matter whether you knew, a new voice said from the doorway. Elira turned. An older woman stood there, dressed in the deep green robes that marked her as a senior healer, her gray hair pulled back tightly, her expression unreadable. Elira recognized the robes immediately, though she had never met the woman wearing them. Every apprentice healer knew the color of authority when they saw it. I'm sorry, Elira said quickly, stepping away from the bed, as though putting distance between herself and the king might undo what had already happened. I heard someone was dying. I only wanted to help. The senior healer walked slowly into the room, her eyes moving from Elira to the king and back again, studying the closed wound with an expression Elira could not read. She crouched beside the bed for a long moment, checking his pulse, his breathing, the color returning to his skin. This is remarkable work, the woman finally said, and for half a second, Elira felt a flicker of relief. Then the woman's eyes lifted to meet hers, sharp and cold. And it is also a very serious problem. I don't understand, Elira said. No, the senior healer agreed. You clearly don't. Come with me, now. Elira followed her out of the room, casting one last glance back at the sleeping king, at the wound she had closed with her own 2 hands, wondering what exactly she had done wrong by saving a man's life. She did not yet understand that healing was never just healing here, not when the patient was the king, not when an untrained, unapproved, unbonded Omega had placed her bare hands against his skin and poured her own energy into his body without permission, without ceremony, and without anyone in the room stopping her in time. The senior healer led her down a different corridor, one lined with closed doors and hushed voices behind them, until they reached a small private chamber near the east courtyard. She gestured for Elira to sit, then closed the door firmly behind them. What is your name? The woman asked. Elira Vance. And you arrived today? Yes, this afternoon. I was told to report to the healing house, but no one gave me instructions beyond that. I was still waiting for someone to show me where I would be staying when I heard the commotion in the west wing. The senior healer studied her for a long moment, arms crossed, her expression softening only slightly. You saved his life. I want you to understand that first, before anything else is said. His wound was infected and deepening. If you had arrived even an hour later, there would have been nothing left to heal. Elira felt a small swell of pride beneath her nerves. Then why does everyone look at me like I've done something terrible? Because you have, the woman said simply. Not because of the healing itself, because of who you are, and who he is, and the fact that no one properly explained the rules to you before you walked through that door. What rules? The senior healer sighed, sitting down across from her, some of the sharpness fading from her posture, replaced by something closer to weariness. The Alpha King has not allowed an unbonded Omega healer near him in over 3 years. Not since an incident that nearly cost him his throne. The council passed strict protocols after that. Any Omega healer must be formally approved, registered, and supervised before treating him. It is meant to protect him. It is meant to protect the entire kingdom from certain complications. What kind of complications? The woman's eyes flicked toward the door, as though making sure no one else could hear. The kind that happen when deep healing energy passes between an alpha and an omega who share no formal bond. It does not always happen. But when the healing is intense enough, when the connection between healer and patient runs deep enough, something can form between them, something that is very difficult to undo. Alira's stomach turned cold. Are you saying that I am saying, the senior healer interrupted, that we will not know until morning. And that you should prepare yourself, Alira Vance. Because whatever happens next is entirely out of your hands, and out of mine as well. Outside, the first light of dawn began to creep over the palace walls, gray and quiet, giving no warning at all of the storm that was about to begin. By the time the sun had fully risen, the entire healing house was awake and whispering. Alira sat alone in the small chamber where the senior healer had left her, her hands still faintly stained green from the paste she had used the night before. No one had come to bring her breakfast. No one had come to tell her what would happen next. She could hear footsteps rushing past the door every few minutes, voices dropping to hushed murmurs the moment they passed, as though the walls themselves might carry word of what she had done straight to the council chambers. She had not slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the king's face again, pale and drawn with pain, and then steady and calm beneath her healing hands. She kept turning the senior healer's words over in her mind. Something can form between them, something that is very difficult to undo. She did not fully understand what that meant, not in practical terms, but she understood enough to know that fear had followed her out of that room and had not yet let go. The door finally opened near midday. 2 guards stood outside, their faces carefully blank this time, trained into neutrality. You are to come with us, one of them said. The council wishes to speak with you. Alira rose on unsteady legs and followed them out of the healing house, through a long covered walkway that connected to the main palace, past gardens she did not have time to admire, and fountains she barely noticed. Her mind was too busy racing through everything that could go wrong. The council chamber was larger and colder than she expected, a circular room with high stone walls and narrow windows that let in thin strips of light. 5 men and 2 women sat behind a long curved table, dressed in robes of deep blue and silver, the official colors of the ruling council. At the center sat an older man with a heavy gray beard, his eyes sharp despite his age, his expression carved from stone. Alira Vance, he said, his voice echoing slightly against the walls. Do you understand why you have been brought here? I believe so, Alira said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, because of what happened last night, because I treated the king without knowing who he was, and without the proper approval. That is correct. The old man leaned forward slightly. Tell us, in your own words, exactly what happened. Alira explained everything, from the moment she heard the scream in the corridor, to the moment the senior healer led her away from the king's chamber. She kept her account simple and honest, not trying to make herself sound better or worse than she had been. She had walked into a room to save a dying man. She had not known who he was. She had done what any healer would do. When she finished, the council members exchanged glances that she could not fully read. One of the women, younger than the others, with sharp eyes and a tightly braided crown of hair, spoke first. You expect us to believe that a healer, arriving today, on her very first evening in the palace, simply wandered into the most heavily guarded chamber in the entire healing house, and treated the king without anyone stopping her. I don't expect you to believe anything, Alira said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. I'm only telling you what happened. If the guards outside that door had wanted to stop me, they could have. I don't know why they didn't. The old man at the center raised a hand before the woman could respond. The guards will be questioned separately. Their failure is a matter for another discussion. His eyes returned to Alira. What concerns this council more urgently is the nature of the healing you performed, and what it may have caused. I only wanted to save his life, Alira said. I didn't think about anything beyond that. That is precisely the problem, the old man said. Healing of that depth, performed by an Omega, on an unbonded Alpha, particularly one of the king's strength, does not come without consequence. Our physicians examined him this morning. They report early signs of a forming connection between healer and patient, the kind that typically only develops through deliberate, sanctioned bonding rituals. Alira's chest tightened. I don't understand what that means for me. It means, the sharp-eyed woman said, that you may have created a bond with the Alpha King without his consent, without the council's approval, and without any of the safeguards that exist specifically to prevent this kind of situation. Do you understand how serious that is? I didn't do it on purpose, Elira said, her voice rising slightly, despite her effort to stay calm. I didn't even know it was possible until the senior healer explained it to me last night. How could I have prevented something I didn't know existed? Murmurs passed through the council members, some sympathetic, others clearly skeptical. The old man raised his hand again for silence. Whether your intentions were good or not does not change the outcome, he said. The bond, if it has truly begun to form, presents serious complications for the kingdom. The king's marriage prospects, his alliances with neighboring territories, his standing among the noble houses, all of these depend on careful arrangements that took years to build. An unsanctioned bond with an unknown healer threatens all of it. Then what happens to me? Elira asked quietly. The old man studied her for a long moment before answering. Until we understand the full extent of what has occurred, you will remain confined to the healing house grounds. You will not leave the palace. You will not attempt to see the king again, under any circumstances. Your badge and your healing privileges are suspended, pending further review. Elira felt the words land like a physical blow. Suspended. As though she had done something shameful, rather than something that had saved a man's life. Is that fair? She asked, before she could stop herself. I walked into a room and stopped a man from dying. If I had known who he was, if I had known any of this, maybe I would have hesitated. But I didn't hesitate, and because of that, he's alive today instead of dead. Doesn't that count for anything? The chamber went quiet. Even the sharp-eyed woman seemed momentarily unsure how to respond. It counts for a great deal, the old man finally said, his voice slightly softer than before. And it will be considered, in time, alongside everything else. But you must understand, young healer, that the world you have stepped into does not operate on good intentions alone. It operates on order, on protocol, on the careful balance of power that keeps this kingdom from falling into chaos. You have disturbed that balance, whether you meant to or not. Elira lowered her eyes, saying nothing more. There was nothing more to say that would change the outcome of this meeting. You are dismissed, the old man said. Guards will escort you back to your quarters. Someone will bring you further instructions, once the physicians complete their assessment of the king's condition. The walk back to the healing house felt endless. Elira kept her eyes forward, ignoring the whispers that followed her through every hallway, the curious and judging glances from healers and servants alike who had clearly already heard the story, twisted and reshaped a dozen times before it reached their ears. By the time she reached her small assigned room, she felt as though she had aged years in the span of a single day. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and stared at her hands, the same hands that had closed a dying man's wound only hours before. She thought about the senior healer's warning, about the council's cold questions, about the strange fear she had seen in the guard's eyes the night before. None of it made sense to her yet. She had done what she was trained to do. She had saved a life. And somehow, that single act had turned her into a problem large enough to summon an entire council. A soft knock came at her door sometime later, interrupting her thoughts. She rose cautiously and opened it to find a young servant girl standing there, holding a tray of food and looking nervously over her shoulder, as though worried about being seen. I brought you something to eat, the girl said quietly. You must be starving. No one thought to bring you anything all day. Thank you, Elira said, taking the tray gratefully. Everyone else seems to think I've done something unforgivable. The girl hesitated, glancing down the hallway once more, before stepping slightly closer and lowering her voice. For what it's worth, not everyone thinks that. Some of us heard what really happened. Some of us think you're brave for walking into that room when no one else would. No one else would? Elira asked, confused. Why not? The girl's expression turned uneasy. The king has been difficult since his injury. Angry. In pain. Several senior healers refused to go near him after he lashed out at one of them 2 nights ago. That's why he was left alone so long that night. That's why no one stopped you when you ran past those guards. They were relieved someone finally went in, even if it wasn't supposed to be you. Elira absorbed this new information slowly, pieces of the story shifting into place. She had not simply walked into a forbidden room by accident. She had walked into a room everyone else had been too afraid to enter. Thank you for telling me, she said. The girl nodded and hurried away, before anyone could see her lingering. Elira closed the door and sat back down with her tray of food, her mind spinning with new questions. If the king had been so difficult that trained healers refused to treat him, why had he allowed her to work on him without resistance? Why had he stayed calm and still beneath her hands, when everyone said he had been lashing out at anyone who came near? She did not have an answer, but she suspected, deep down, that she would find out soon enough, whether the council wanted her to or not. The days that followed felt like a slow, quiet punishment. Elira was allowed to move only within a small section of the healing house, her badge taken, her name whispered up and down every corridor she passed. Some healers offered her sympathetic looks. Others turned away entirely, as if her presence might somehow bring trouble down on them too. She spent her mornings reviewing old healing texts by herself, since no one had assigned her any real duties, and her afternoons staring out the narrow window of her room at the courtyard below, watching servants and guards go about their business as though nothing unusual had happened at all. On the fourth day, the senior healer who had first questioned her, a woman named Dessa, came to see her again. "You look thinner," Dessa said, stepping into the small room without waiting for an invitation. "Are you eating?" "When someone remembers to bring food," Elira said. "I'm not exactly a priority around here anymore." Dessa's expression softened slightly, and she pulled the room's only chair closer to the bed before sitting down. "The council has not forgotten you, if that is any comfort. Their physicians have spent the last 3 days examining the king. The findings are not simple." Elira sat up straighter. "What did they find?" "A bond thread," Dessa said carefully. "Faint, but present. It formed during the healing, exactly as I feared it might. It is not yet a full bond, not the kind that alphas and omegas form through deliberate ceremony, but it is more than nothing. If left alone, it will likely deepen over time. If actively resisted by both parties, it may fade without ever fully forming." "So there's a way to stop it," Elira said, relief flooding through her. "There may be," Dessa said, "but that decision does not belong to you alone. It depends on the king as well, and unfortunately, no one has been able to get a clear answer from him." "What do you mean?" Dessa hesitated, choosing her words with visible care. "He has asked about you. Several times, according to his attendants. He has not said whether he wishes the bond to be broken or allowed to continue. He has simply asked who you are, and why no one told him your name before you disappeared from his chamber." Elira did not know how to respond to that. She had assumed the king would want nothing to do with her, would see her as nothing more than an inconvenient complication to be dealt with and forgotten. The idea that he had been asking after her felt strange and unsettling, though she could not quite name why. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Dessa said, rising from her chair, "the council debates, and you wait. I know that is not the answer you wanted, but it is the truth." Dessa left soon after, and Elira spent the rest of the evening turning the conversation over in her mind. A bond thread, something the king had apparently not rejected outright, despite every reason to want it gone. She told herself it did not matter what he wanted. She told herself she would be relieved once the council decided to sever whatever strange connection had formed between them, freeing her from this entire mess and allowing her to return to the quiet, ordinary life of a healer she had imagined for herself before any of this began. But some small, stubborn part of her mind kept circling back to his face in that dim room, calm and trusting beneath her hands, and she could not fully explain why the thought of severing anything left an uncomfortable ache somewhere beneath her ribs. The following morning, a commotion outside her window pulled her from her thoughts. She looked down into the courtyard and saw a group of nobles gathered near the entrance to the healing house, their fine clothing marking them as members of the wealthier houses that supported the council. Among them stood a tall man with cold eyes and an expensive cloak, speaking in low, urgent tones to 2 council members who had come outside to meet him. Elira did not recognize the man, but something about the tension in his posture, the sharp gestures of his hands, made her uneasy. She watched as one of the council members glanced up toward the healing house windows, almost as if searching for her specifically, before the group disappeared back inside. Later that day, Dessa returned, looking troubled in a way Elira had not seen from her before. "Who was that man in the courtyard this morning?" Elira asked immediately. "The one in the gray cloak." Dessa's mouth tightened. That was Lord Cassian Vale, one of the most influential nobles on the council's outer circle. His family has spent years arranging a potential marriage, between the king and his niece. A match meant to secure peace along the northern border. Elira's stomach dropped. And now there's a bond thread instead. Now there's a bond thread instead, Dessa confirmed. Lord Vale is not pleased. He has been pushing the council to have the thread severed immediately, by force if necessary, before it can deepen any further. Can they do that? Force it? There are methods, Dessa said carefully. None of them pleasant. All of them painful, for both parties involved. The council has not yet approved such measures, but Lord Vale carries significant influence. If he continues to press the matter, they may have little choice but to consider it. Elira felt a chill settle over her skin. And the king? Does he know Lord Vale is pushing for this? I would assume so, Dessa said, though I could not tell you what he thinks of it. That night, Elira barely slept at all, her mind circling endlessly through worst possibilities. She pictured herself being dragged before some painful ritual meant to tear apart a connection she had never asked to form in the first place, all because a nobleman feared losing a political marriage he had spent years arranging. She pictured the king agreeing to it without hesitation, eager to rid himself of an unwanted Omega healer who had complicated his carefully built future. She did not know, in that moment, that the king himself was lying awake in his own chamber, only a short distance away, staring at the ceiling above his bed, thinking of nothing and no one, except the quiet, steady healer who had saved his life without asking his name. 2 days later, everything changed again. Elira was summoned early in the morning, pulled from a restless half-sleep by a guard knocking sharply at her door. "You're wanted in the council chamber," he said. Immediately. Her stomach twisted with dread as she followed him through the familiar corridors, bracing herself for whatever news awaited her. Perhaps the council had already decided. Perhaps Lord Vale had won his argument, and she was being called in only to be told what would happen to her next, whether she agreed to it or not. But when she entered the chamber, she found something she had not expected at all. The king was there. He sat in a high-backed chair near the council's curved table, dressed in dark formal robes that did nothing to hide the lean strength of his frame. His face, once pale and drawn with pain, now held healthy color, his dark eyes sharp and alert, as they turned toward her the moment she stepped through the door. For a brief, disorienting moment, Elira simply stared at him, struck by how different he looked awake and upright, compared to the dying man she remembered from that dim, blood-soaked room. "Elira Vance," the old council leader said, his voice carrying its usual formal weight. "The king has requested to speak with you directly. The council has agreed, given the unusual nature of this situation." Elira's eyes flicked toward the king, uncertain what to say, uncertain what expression to arrange on her own face. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze steady and unreadable, before he finally spoke. "You're the one who saved my life," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Elira answered, keeping her voice as even as she could manage. "I didn't know who you were at the time. I'm told that matters a great deal to everyone in this room, except, apparently, you." A flicker of something crossed his face, surprise perhaps, or the faintest trace of amusement, quickly hidden. Lord Vale, standing near the edge of the chamber with his arms crossed, made a small sound of disapproval at her boldness, but the king ignored him entirely. "No one has spoken to me so plainly in years," the king said. "Do you know why that is?" "I imagine because you're the king," Elira said. "People tend to be careful around kings." "They tend to be careful around anyone with power," he corrected. "Careful, and calculating, and always searching for something to gain. You walked into my chamber not knowing any of that. You saw only a dying man, and you tried to save him. Do you understand how rare that is?" Elira did not know how to respond, so she said nothing at all. The king turned his attention to the council, his expression hardening into something more commanding. "This council has spent days debating what to do about a bond thread that formed, because every trained healer in this palace was too afraid to enter my chamber the night I nearly died. I would like someone to explain to me how that failure became her punishment instead of theirs." Silence fell across the room. Lord Vale's jaw tightened visibly, though he said nothing. "Your Majesty," the old council leader said carefully, "the concern is not one of blame, but of consequence. The bond thread complicates delicate matters of state that took years to arrange. Then let the council discuss consequences among people who actually created the situation," the king said, his voice sharp now, carrying an authority that filled every corner of the chamber. Reinstate her badge, lift the restrictions on her movement. Whatever else this council decides about the bond, it will decide with her present in the discussion, not locked away in a small room while others determine her fate without her voice. Illyra felt something loosen in her chest, relief and disbelief tangled together, though a small, cautious part of her mind wondered exactly what price might come attached to the king's sudden protection. The council chamber emptied slowly after the king's declaration, nobles and officials filing out in murmuring clusters, none of them quite daring to challenge him further. Lord Vale lingered longest, his eyes cutting toward Illyra, with open dislike, before he finally swept from the room, his grey cloak snapping behind him like a warning. "Walk with me," the king said, rising from his chair. It was not a request, though his tone carried none of the harsh command he had used moments before. Illyra hesitated only briefly, before falling into step beside him, as he led her out through a side door and into a quiet garden courtyard she had not seen before, tucked away behind the council chambers, shaded by tall trees and lined with early blooming flowers. "You didn't have to do that," Illyra said once they were alone, the guards keeping a respectful distance near the courtyard entrance. "Defend me, in front of the entire council, I mean." "I disagree," the king said. "I had every reason to. You saved my life while trained healers hid behind excuses. It would have been far easier for me to let the council punish you and move on, but easier is not always right. Most people in your position would choose easier anyway," Illyra said. He glanced at her sideways, something like curiosity in his expression. "You speak to me the way very few people do." "I'm not trying to be disrespectful," Illyra said quickly. "It's only that I don't know how to be anything other than honest. I never learned how to soften things for people with titles." "Don't apologize for it," the king said. "It's the reason I asked to see you today. Everyone else in this palace speaks to me as though I might shatter from the wrong word, or as though flattering me might earn them something later. You walked into my chamber not knowing my name, and treated me exactly the way you would treat anyone bleeding on a bed. That is worth more to me than any title ever could be." They walked in silence for a moment, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves overhead and the distant call of birds somewhere beyond the courtyard walls. "May I ask you something?" Illyra finally said. "Of course. Do you know what happened? The night you were attacked, I mean. Do you remember who did it?" The king's expression darkened slightly, the warmth from a moment before fading into something more guarded. "I remember very little. I was riding back from the northern border when my escort was ambushed. I remember pain, and darkness, and very little else, until I woke to find you gone from my chamber, and half the healing house, whispering about bond threads." "I'm sorry," Illyra said. "I didn't mean to bring up something painful." "You didn't," the king said. "I would rather speak plainly about it than pretend it never happened, the way everyone else seems eager to do. Someone tried to kill me, Illyra. I intend to find out who, eventually. For now, I would rather focus on more immediate matters." Such as this bond thread the physicians keep whispering about," he said, stopping beneath the shade of a large tree and turning to face her fully. "Tell me honestly, do you feel anything unusual? Any pull? Any change? Since that night?" Illyra considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know how to describe it exactly. There's something, a kind of awareness maybe, whenever I think about that room, about you. I assumed it was only stress, or exhaustion from everything that's happened since. I didn't realize it might be something more until Dessa explained the bond thread to me." "I feel it too," the king admitted, his voice quieter now. "I did not understand what it was at first either. I only knew that when I woke, the first thing on my mind was not my kingdom, or my enemies, or even the attack itself. It was wondering who had been kneeling beside my bed, and why her hands had felt like the first honest touch I'd experienced in years." Illyra's cheeks warmed unexpectedly at his words, and she looked away, unsure how to respond to such an admission from a man she had met only days ago, under circumstances neither of them had chosen. "The council wants it severed," she said instead, steering the conversation toward safer ground. "Lord Vale especially." "Lord Vale wants many things," the king said, a hint of irritation returning to his voice. "Most of them serve his family's ambitions more than they serve this kingdom. I have not yet decided what I want regarding the bond thread, and I do not appreciate being pushed toward a decision before I've had time to consider it properly." "What would severing it involve?" Illyra asked. Dessa mentioned it wouldn't be pleasant. It is not, the king said grimly. I've heard of it done before, in rare cases. It requires both parties to undergo a ritual that essentially forces the bond thread to unravel before it can strengthen naturally. The process causes significant pain to both people involved, and there is no guarantee it fully succeeds. Sometimes the thread simply reforms weeks or months later, stronger than before, having only been provoked rather than truly removed. Alira absorbed this information slowly. So there's a real chance that trying to force it apart could make things worse. There is, the king agreed, which is precisely why I intend to resist Lord Vale's pressure until I understand this bond thread far better than I do now. I did not survive an assassination attempt, only to make a hasty decision that could cause needless pain to either of us. They continued walking through the quiet courtyard, the conversation shifting gradually into lighter topics, small questions about her training as a healer, about the village she had come from before arriving at the palace, about the years of study that had led her to this strange, unexpected moment. Alira found herself relaxing slightly despite everything, surprised by how easy it felt to speak with him once the weight of titles and formalities was set aside. Your Majesty, a voice called from the courtyard entrance, interrupting them. Alira turned to see a guard approaching quickly, his expression tense. The king's posture straightened immediately, all warmth vanishing from his face, replaced by the sharp alertness of a ruler, accustomed to sudden trouble. What is it? The king asked. A message from the Northern Watch, the guard said, lowering his voice as he reached them, though not quite low enough to keep Alira from hearing every word. They've found something near the site of the ambush, evidence of who may have organized the attack. The king's jaw tightened. Bring the report to my private chamber immediately. I'll review it myself. The guard nodded and hurried away. The king turned back to Alira, some of the earlier warmth returning to his expression, though tempered now with clear concern. I have to attend to this, he said. But I meant what I said in the council chamber. Your badge will be reinstated, your restrictions lifted. You are free to move through the palace and the healing house as you please. Thank you, Alira said, truly. Don't thank me yet, the king said, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. I suspect this is only the beginning of a great deal of trouble for both of us. He left her standing alone in the quiet courtyard, the sound of his footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving her with far more questions than answers. Someone had tried to kill him. Someone powerful enough to organize an ambush against a king's escort, patient enough to plan it carefully, and dangerous enough that the attempt had very nearly succeeded. And now, tangled unexpectedly into the middle of it all, was a bond thread neither of them had asked for, connecting her fate to his, in ways she was only beginning to understand. She made her way back to the healing house that afternoon with her badge freshly reinstated, greeted this time by curious glances rather than fearful ones. Dessa met her at the entrance, eyebrows raised in silent question. Well, Dessa said, it seems you've made quite an impression. I didn't ask for any of this, Alira said honestly. No one ever does, Dessa replied, but here you are all the same. Come, there's work to be done, and I imagine you'll want something useful to occupy your mind, besides council politics and bond threads. Alira followed her inside, grateful for the distraction of familiar healing duties, though even as she busied herself preparing remedies and checking on minor injuries throughout the afternoon, her thoughts kept drifting back to the king's words in the garden, to the strange new awareness humming quietly beneath her ribs, and to the unsettling report that had pulled him away so abruptly, promising trouble neither of them could yet fully imagine. Word of the king's public defense of Alira spread through the palace, faster than any healing remedy could travel through a wound. By the following morning, servants who had once avoided her eyes now greeted her, with careful politeness, uncertain how to treat someone who had captured the king's attention so completely. Other healers watched her with a mixture of curiosity and quiet resentment, whispering behind cupped hands whenever she passed. Alira tried to ignore all of it, focusing instead on the work in front of her, tending to minor injuries and restocking healing supplies as though her life had not been turned upside down in the span of a single week. Dessa found her in the storage room late one afternoon, sorting through jars of dried herbs. You've become quite the topic of conversation, Dessa said, leaning against the doorway. I've noticed, Alira said dryly. I'm not sure whether to be flattered or terrified. A bit of both is probably wise, Dessa said. The king has requested you again, by the way. He wants you present when the Northern Watch delivers their full report on the ambush investigation. Alira paused, a jar of chamomile still in her hands. Why would he want a healer present for something like that? I couldn't say, Dessa admitted. Perhaps he simply wants you nearby. Perhaps there's something more practical behind it. Either way, you're expected in the private council room within the hour. Alira set down the jar and smoothed her healer's robes, trying to steady the nervous flutter in her chest. She made her way through the palace corridors, past guards who now nodded to her with quiet respect rather than suspicion, until she reached the private council room, tucked away from the main chamber, where she had first faced the full council. Inside, the king stood near a large table covered with maps and scattered papers, his expression tense and focused. Two men she recognized as senior members of the Northern Watch stood nearby, along with Dessa, who must have hurried ahead of her, and, standing near the far wall with obvious displeasure, Lord Vale. Ah, there she is, the king said as Alira entered, gesturing for her to join them near the table. I want a healer present who has no ties to the council's political games, someone who can look at this objectively. Your Majesty, I hardly think a healer's opinion is relevant to matters of state security, Lord Vale said stiffly. Your opinion on relevance was noted the first 3 times you offered it, the king replied without looking at him, his tone carrying enough authority to end the objection immediately. He turned back to Alira. The Northern Watch found something near the ambush site. A container of poison residue, along with tracks suggesting the attackers waited there for some time before my escort passed. I want your opinion on the poison itself, since our physicians disagree on its origin. One of the Northern Watch officers stepped forward, presenting a small sealed vial containing a dark, sticky substance. Alira took it carefully, uncorking it just enough to catch a faint whiff of the contents inside. She recognized the smell instantly, bitter and slightly metallic, a combination she had studied extensively during her training. This isn't a poison meant to kill quickly, she said slowly, studying the substance closer. It's designed to weaken the body over time, to make an injury far more dangerous than it would otherwise be. If this was used on the blade that wounded you, it would explain why the injury deepened so quickly, despite initial treatment from your physicians. Can you identify where it comes from? The king asked. Alira hesitated, turning the vial slowly in her hands. This particular preparation is rare. It requires ingredients that don't grow naturally in this region. I've only seen it once before, during my training, in a text describing poisons favored by certain noble houses in the Eastern Territories, families with old grudges and long memories. The room went silent. Lord Vale's face had gone slightly pale, though he quickly masked it with a scowl. Eastern Territories, the king repeated slowly. That narrows things considerably. Very few families from that region have reason to want me dead, and fewer still would have the resources to organize an ambush this precise. There is one family that comes to mind, Dessa said quietly. The Ashgrove line. They lost significant influence over trade routes when your father redrew the eastern borders decades ago. There have been rumors of resentment passed down through their family for years. The Ashgrove family has no standing at court any longer, Lord Vale said quickly, perhaps too quickly. Surely you don't mean to suggest they orchestrated something this elaborate? I mean to suggest nothing yet, the king said, his eyes narrowing slightly at Lord Vale's sudden defensiveness. But I intend to investigate every possibility thoroughly, starting with this poison and its origins. Alira, would you be willing to examine any further evidence the Northern Watch uncovers? Your knowledge of rare poisons could prove valuable. Of course, Alira said, surprised, but pleased to have a genuine purpose beyond simply existing at the center of palace gossip. Lord Vale's jaw tightened visibly, but he said nothing further, excusing himself from the room shortly after, with a stiff bow toward the king. Alira watched him go, an uneasy feeling settling in her stomach that she couldn't quite explain. You don't trust him, the king observed once the door closed behind Lord Vale. I don't know him well enough to trust or distrust him, Alira said carefully, but he seemed very quick to dismiss the idea of the Ashgrove family, and very uncomfortable when the topic came up at all. I noticed the same thing, the king admitted. Lord Vale has always been ambitious, eager to see his niece married into the royal family for the influence it would bring his house. I wouldn't put it past him to have connections I'm not yet aware of. Do you think he's involved in the ambush? Elira asked. I don't know, the king said honestly. But I intend to find out, carefully and quietly, before making any accusations that could tear this court apart without proof. Over the following days, Elira found herself increasingly drawn into the investigation, her knowledge of poisons and remedies proving useful each time the Northern Watch uncovered new evidence. She spent hours examining samples, comparing them against old healing texts, tracing possible origins back through trade routes and noble family histories. The work gave her purpose, a welcome distraction from the strange, persistent awareness of the bond thread humming quietly beneath her thoughts whenever the king was near. She also found herself spending more time in his company than she ever could have anticipated, their conversations gradually shifting from cautious formality into something more comfortable, even easy. He asked about her life before the palace, about the small village where she had grown up, about the healer who had first recognized her gift and trained her in secret when her own family could not afford proper instruction. She found herself asking about his childhood in turn, about the weight of ruling a kingdom from such a young age after his father's sudden passing, about the loneliness that seemed to follow him despite being surrounded constantly by advisors, guards, and nobles vying for his favor. You're the first person in years who has asked me questions without wanting something from me in return, he admitted one evening, as they walked together through the same quiet garden courtyard where they had first spoken privately. Maybe I'm just naturally curious, Elira said, though she knew, even as she said it, that it was more than simple curiosity drawing her toward him. Maybe, he said, a faint smile touching his lips. Or maybe the bond thread is doing exactly what Dessa warned it might, drawing us closer whether we intended it or not. Elira did not have a response to that. She only knew that despite every warning, despite Lord Vale's obvious disapproval, despite the council's ongoing debate over whether the thread should be severed entirely, she found herself reluctant to imagine a version of events where she and the king simply returned to being strangers, as though the healing that had saved his life had never happened at all. The royal physicians called for a formal examination of the bond thread nearly 2 weeks after the ambush, gathering in a private chamber lined with old texts and strange instruments Elira had never seen used before. Dessa stood beside her for support, while the king sat across the room, his expression carefully composed, despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. The lead physician, an elderly man named Corwin, with thinning white hair and spectacles perched low on his nose, explained the process carefully before beginning. We will use a resonance stone, he said, holding up a smooth, pale gray stone that seemed to catch the light strangely as he turned it. When held by both parties simultaneously, it reveals the strength and nature of any bond thread present. This will help us understand exactly what we're dealing with before any decisions are made about severing it. Elira exchanged a glance with the king before both of them stepped forward, each placing one hand against the smooth surface of the stone. The moment their skin made contact through the stone, a soft warmth spread up Elira's arm, and the stone itself began to glow faintly, threads of pale golden light visible just beneath its surface, pulsing gently in rhythm, with something that felt uncomfortably like a heartbeat. Remarkable, Corwin murmured, studying the light with professional fascination. The thread has strengthened considerably since the initial reports. This is no longer merely an early formation. It has progressed into something closer to a genuine bond, though not yet fully complete. What does that mean, in practical terms? The king asked, his voice tight. It means, Corwin said, setting the stone down carefully, that severing this thread now would be considerably more difficult and more painful than it would have been 2 weeks ago. The bond has deepened through continued proximity between you both. Every conversation, every shared moment, has strengthened it further. Elira felt her cheeks warm, with something between embarrassment and an emotion she wasn't ready to name. She glanced at the king, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, somewhere between curiosity and quiet concern. Can it still be severed at all? Lord Vale asked from where he stood near the back of the chamber, having insisted on attending the examination despite the king's clear reluctance to include him. It can, Corwin said carefully, but I would strongly advise against it at this stage. The pain involved in severing a bond this developed would be significant, and there remains real risk that the thread could reform stronger than before, having only been provoked rather than truly removed. In cases this advanced, I have seen the process leave both parties weakened for months afterward, sometimes with lasting effects on their health. Then perhaps the council should reconsider its position entirely, the king said, his eyes flicking toward Lord Vale with clear challenge in them. Your Majesty, Lord Vale said stiffly, the council's concerns remain unchanged, regardless of the thread's current strength. Your marriage prospects, the alliances tied to them, the stability of the northern border, all of these depend on arrangements that a bond with an unapproved Omega healer directly threatens. An unapproved Omega healer who saved my life, while every trained healer in this palace hid behind excuses, the king said sharply. I grow tired of hearing that phrase, Lord Vale. Perhaps it is time the council considered whether those old marriage arrangements still serve this kingdom, rather than simply serving certain noble families. The chamber fell into tense silence. Corwin busied himself gathering his instruments, clearly eager to remove himself from the growing conflict between king and council member. Dessa shifted uncomfortably beside Alira, though she said nothing. I will bring this matter before the full council, Lord Vale said finally, his voice clipped with barely restrained frustration. They will not be pleased to hear the bond has been allowed to strengthen this far, without proper intervention. Bring it before whoever you wish, the king said. My decision remains the same. I will not force a painful ritual onto myself, or onto Alira, simply to satisfy arrangements made years before either of us had any say in the matter. Lord Vale left the chamber without further argument, though the look he cast toward Alira on his way out carried a coldness that sent an uneasy chill through her. She had grown accustomed to his obvious disapproval over the past weeks, but something about his expression in that moment felt different, sharper, more calculating than simple political frustration. You shouldn't make an enemy of him on my account, Alira said quietly, once the chamber had emptied, except for herself, the king, and Dessa. I'm not making an enemy of him, the king said. He made himself my problem the moment he began pushing me toward decisions that serve his family's ambitions, rather than my own judgment. This has little to do with you specifically, Alira, and everything to do with a pattern I've noticed since taking the throne. Still, Alira said, a man like that, cornered and frustrated, worries me more than one who simply disagrees openly. Dessa nodded slowly in agreement. She's not wrong to be cautious. Lord Vale has powerful allies within the council, and men who feel their influence slipping sometimes act in ways that surprise everyone around them. The king's expression grew thoughtful, though he did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned toward Alira, his gaze softening slightly. Regardless of what Lord Vale does next, I meant what I said. I have no intention of severing this bond, simply because it complicates old arrangements. Do you feel the same, or has all of this become more burden than you're willing to carry? Alira considered the question honestly before answering. Weeks ago, she would have said yes without hesitation, desperate to return to the simple life she had imagined for herself before any of this began. But sitting here now, having spent so many quiet evenings in his company, having found in him someone who spoke to her plainly, and listened just as carefully in return, she found that her answer had changed in ways she hadn't fully realized, until this exact moment. I don't want it severed, she admitted quietly. I didn't expect to feel that way, but I do. Something shifted in the king's expression, warmth replacing the tension that had gathered there throughout the difficult conversation with Lord Vale. Then we'll face whatever comes next together, whatever the council decides. Dessa cleared her throat gently, breaking the moment with practical concern. Whatever you decide, both of you should be prepared for consequences. Lord Vale will not simply accept defeat quietly, and the northern investigation into the ambush remains unresolved. I would advise caution in the days ahead, for both your sakes. Her warning proved prophetic sooner than any of them expected. That very night, as Alira made her way back toward the healing house, after a long evening spent reviewing poison samples with the Northern Watch officers, she noticed a figure lingering near the shadows of the courtyard entrance, watching her with an intensity that made her steps falter. By the time she looked directly toward the figure, whoever it was had already slipped away into the darkness, leaving her with nothing but an uneasy feeling crawling up her spine, and the growing certainty that Lord Vale's frustration might soon become something far more dangerous than simple political maneuvering. The rumors began quietly at first. Small whispers passed between servants that Alira barely caught in passing. Within a week, however, they had grown into something impossible to ignore. Merchants in the city market spoke of an Omega healer who had bewitched the king, using forbidden techniques to force a bond he never would have chosen freely. Nobles at court exchanged knowing glances whenever Alira passed, their voices dropping into whispers that carried just loud enough for her to hear fragments meant to wound. Some claimed she had planned the entire encounter, from the moment she arrived at the palace, deliberately positioning herself to seize power through manipulation rather than skill. "It's not true," Alira said to Dessa one afternoon, her hands trembling slightly, as she prepared a healing salve in the storage room. "None of it is true. I didn't plan any of this." "I know that," Dessa said gently, "and so does anyone who witnessed what actually happened that night. But rumors rarely need truth to spread, Alira. They only need enough people willing to repeat them." "Who would spread something like this?" Alira asked, though she already suspected the answer. Dessa's expression turned grim. "I have my suspicions, though proving them will be difficult. Lord Vale has considerable reach throughout the city, connections among merchants and nobles alike. It would not surprise me if these rumors originated from his household, carefully planted to turn public opinion against you, before the council makes any final decision about the bond." Alira set down the mortar and pestle she had been using, frustration and hurt tangling together in her chest. "Even if I could prove where the rumors started, would it matter? People already believe what they want to believe." "It matters to the king," Dessa said, "and it matters to those of us who know you. Don't let cruel words convince you of something false about yourself." Despite Dessa's reassurance, the rumors continued to spread, growing more elaborate with each retelling. By the following week, Alira found herself the subject of open hostility whenever she ventured beyond the healing house grounds. A group of merchants refused to sell her supplies in the market, muttering about witchcraft and manipulation under their breath. Children in the courtyard, encouraged by whispers overheard from their parents, sometimes pointed and stared as she passed, whispering words she pretended not to hear. The king grew increasingly frustrated as the rumors reached his own ears, though his frustration seemed directed more at the situation itself than at Alira. "This has gone too far," he said one evening, pacing the length of his private study, while Alira sat quietly nearby, watching him with concern. "I've had merchants petition the council directly, demanding an investigation into whether you used forbidden methods to force this bond, as though such a thing were even possible through healing alone. Maybe it would be easier if I simply left the palace," Alira said quietly. "Return to my village. Let all of this settle without me here to keep stirring it further." The king stopped pacing immediately, turning to face her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Is that truly what you want?" "No," Alira admitted. "But I don't know how much more of this I can bear, knowing that every rumor chips away at how people see you as well. I don't want to be the reason your kingdom loses faith in your judgment." "You are not the reason," the king said firmly, crossing the room to sit beside her. "Lord Vale is the reason, or whoever is helping him spread these lies. I refuse to let cowardly whispers dictate decisions that belong to us alone." "How do we stop it then?" Alira asked. "The rumors, I mean. They only seem to grow stronger the longer we ignore them." The king considered this for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Perhaps ignoring them was the mistake. Perhaps it's time to address the situation publicly, directly, rather than allowing whispers to shape the narrative unchallenged. "What do you have in mind?" "A public gathering," he said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke. "An opportunity for the people to see us both, to hear the truth directly, rather than through twisted rumors passed from mouth to mouth. It's a risk, certainly, but perhaps a necessary one." Dessa, who had been quietly working nearby preparing supplies, looked up with clear concern. "A public gathering invites its own dangers, Your Majesty. Someone attempted to kill you only weeks ago. Standing openly before a large crowd, especially one already stirred up by rumor and suspicion, seems unwise." "I understand the risk," the king said, "but hiding away has only allowed the rumors to grow unchecked. Sometimes the greater danger lies in silence rather than action." Despite Dessa's reservations, the king moved forward with his plan over the following days, announcing a public address to be held in the central courtyard of the palace grounds, open to nobles and common citizens alike. Word spread quickly throughout the city, curiosity and skepticism mingling in equal measure among those who planned to attend. Alira spent the days leading up to the address in a state of constant nervousness, uncertain what she would say if called upon to speak, uncertain how the crowd might react to seeing her standing openly beside the king she had supposedly bewitched through forbidden means. Dessa helped her prepare as best she could, offering quiet reassurance and practical advice, though nothing could fully calm the anxious knot that had settled permanently in Alira's stomach. On the morning of the address, the central courtyard filled with more people than Alira had expected. Nobles in fine clothing standing near the front, alongside common citizens who had traveled from throughout the city, all drawn by curiosity about the healer at the center of so much scandal. Alira stood slightly behind the king as he addressed the crowd, her heart pounding, as hundreds of eyes flickered between him and her, with obvious speculation. "I have heard the rumors circulating through this city," the king began, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, commanding attention, despite the murmuring crowd. "Rumors suggesting that the healer standing beside me used forbidden methods to force a bond upon me against my will. I stand before you today to say plainly that these rumors are false." A ripple of surprised murmurs passed through the crowd. Alira kept her eyes forward, trying to steady her breathing despite the weight of so many stares. "This woman saved my life," the king continued, while trained healers within my own palace hesitated out of fear. "She did not know my identity when she treated me. She acted only out of the instinct to heal, an instinct this kingdom should honor rather than condemn. The bond that formed between us was not planned, not forced, and certainly not the product of any forbidden manipulation. It formed because deep healing sometimes creates connections neither party intends nor controls." He paused, letting his words settle over the crowd before continuing. "I understand that this bond complicates certain expectations, certain arrangements made on my behalf, before I had any say in the matter. But I will not allow fear and rumor to dictate decisions that belong rightfully to me, and to her. If this kingdom cannot accept honesty and genuine connection over calculated political convenience, then perhaps it is time we examined why that is." The courtyard fell into a tense, uncertain silence following his words. Alira scanned the crowd nervously, uncertain what reaction to expect, when a voice finally called out from somewhere near the back. "She saved the king's life. That should count for something." Other voices joined in agreement, scattered at first, but growing steadily, as more people found their courage. Not everyone in the crowd seemed convinced, skepticism still visible on many faces, particularly among the nobles standing near the front, but the overwhelming hostility Alira had feared did not fully materialize. Instead, something more complicated emerged, a crowd divided between suspicion and grudging respect, uncertain what to make of a king willing to defend an unlikely healer so openly before them all. As the address concluded and the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about what they had witnessed, Alira caught sight of a familiar gray cloak disappearing quickly through a side gate near the courtyard's edge. Lord Vale, she realized, had been watching the entire address from a distance, his expression unreadable even from afar, though something about the hurried pace of his departure left Alira with the distinct, uneasy feeling that this was far from finished. 3 nights after the public address, Alira woke to the sound of shouting somewhere deep within the palace grounds. She sat up quickly, her heart hammering, and made her way to the window of her small room, peering out into the darkness. Torches moved rapidly across the courtyard below, guards rushing in formations she had never seen practiced before, their urgent voices carrying faintly through the night air. Something had happened, something serious enough to pull the entire palace guard from their beds in the middle of the night. She dressed quickly and made her way toward the healing house's main hall, where she found Dessa already awake, directing several junior healers as they gathered supplies with practiced efficiency. "What's happening?" Alira asked, hurrying to help. "An attempt on the king's life," Dessa said grimly, not pausing in her work. "Someone tried to poison his evening meal. Fortunately, his personal taster fell ill before the king ate more than a few bites, giving the guards enough warning to intervene." Alira's stomach dropped. "Is he all right?" "Shaken, but unharmed," Dessa said. "The taster is in serious condition, however. I need every healer available immediately." Alira followed Dessa through the corridors toward the king's private chambers, where a young man lay on a cot, his skin pale and clammy, his breathing shallow and irregular. Alira recognized the symptoms instantly, the same bitter, metallic scent she had identified weeks earlier lingering faintly around his mouth. "This is the same poison," she said immediately, kneeling beside the cot to examine him more closely. "The one found near the ambush site. Someone used the same preparation again." "Can you treat it?" Dessa asked. "I believe so. Illyra said, already reaching for her healing supplies. I studied the properties extensively, while working with the Northern Watch. Get me clean water, and the yellow root extract from the third shelf, quickly. Dessa hurried to gather the supplies while Illyra worked steadily, applying pressure to specific points along the young man's arms and neck to slow the poison's spread through his body, while carefully administering small amounts of the yellow root extract to counteract its effects. The process took nearly 2 hours, sweat gathering on her brow as she focused every ounce of her training on keeping the taster alive. By the time the poison's effects finally began to ease, the young man's breathing steadying into something more normal, Illyra sat back exhausted, her hands trembling slightly from the sustained effort. Only then did she notice the king, standing quietly in the doorway, watching the entire process with an expression of profound relief mixed with barely contained anger. He'll live, Illyra said, meeting the king's eyes. It will take him several days to fully recover, but the poison hasn't caused lasting damage. Thank you, the king said, his voice tight with emotion. Thank you for saving him, and likely for saving me as well, since I would have eaten far more of that meal had he not fallen ill so quickly. Whoever did this knew exactly what poison to use, Illyra said, rising carefully to her feet. The same preparation from the ambush site. This wasn't a random attempt. Someone with access to your kitchen, someone who knew about the earlier poison, arranged this deliberately. The king's expression darkened. I intend to find out exactly who that is, and I no longer have patience for careful, quiet investigation. Gather the kitchen staff immediately. Every single person who had access to my meal tonight will be questioned. The investigation that followed uncovered a troubling pattern. Several kitchen staff members reported that a visiting merchant, someone new to the palace grounds who claimed to be delivering rare spices for the royal kitchen, had been given unusual access to the preparation area earlier that evening, vouched for by a household steward employed within Lord Vale's estate. When guards were sent to Lord Vale's residence to question him directly, they found the household in chaos, servants reporting that their lord had left suddenly earlier that night, taking only a small bag of belongings and departing through a rear gate without explanation. He's fled, the king said grimly, standing before the assembled council the following morning, the weight of sleepless hours visible in the tension around his eyes, which tells us everything we need to know about his involvement. We cannot be certain of guilt simply because a man chose to travel unexpectedly, one of the older council members argued, though his voice lacked conviction. His steward arranged access for the very merchant now confirmed to have poisoned my meal, the king said sharply. That same poison matches the preparation used in the ambush that nearly killed me weeks ago. I think we can be reasonably certain of his involvement, unless someone here wishes to argue otherwise. No one spoke further in Lord Vale's defense. The sharp-eyed woman who had questioned Illyra so critically during her first appearance before the council now looked troubled, glancing between the king and her fellow council members with obvious concern. If Lord Vale organized both attempts, she said slowly, his motivation likely extends beyond simple political frustration over the bond thread. Men do not risk treason merely to preserve a marriage arrangement for their niece. No, the king agreed, which suggests something larger at play, perhaps ambitions toward the throne itself, using his niece's proposed marriage as merely one avenue toward greater influence, with assassination serving as another, should that avenue fail to satisfy his true goals. Illyra, standing quietly near the back of the chamber where Dessa had brought her to report on the taster's condition, felt a chill settle over her as the pieces began fitting together. Lord Vale's frustration had never been simply about a threatened marriage arrangement. It had been about power, about a path toward the throne that the bond thread and Illyra's presence had unexpectedly complicated. We need to find him, the king said, addressing the council with renewed urgency, before he can regroup, gather allies, or attempt something even more dangerous than poison in a meal. I want every available guard searching the surrounding territories immediately. The search began within the hour, guards dispatched throughout the city and beyond, questioning merchants and travelers for any sign of Lord Vale's whereabouts. Illyra spent the following days assisting wherever she could, examining any further evidence gathered by the investigators, her knowledge of poisons proving useful once again as they traced the merchant's supplies back to their true origin. It was during this examination, 3 days after Lord Vale's disappearance, that Illyra made a discovery that changed everything. Buried among the merchant's confiscated belongings was a small ledger, water-damaged but still partially legible, containing records of payments made to various individuals throughout the palace over the past several months. Names Alira did not recognize filled most of the pages, but one entry near the back caught her attention immediately. A payment recorded weeks before the original ambush, made to someone identified only by initials that matched, unmistakably, the household steward who had vouched for the poisoning merchant. But it was the amount listed beside a separate entry, dated just 2 days before the ambush itself, that made her blood run cold. The payment had been extraordinarily large, far beyond what a single steward's cooperation would warrant, and the notation beside it read simply, "For the Northern Watch Captain's silence." Alira brought the ledger immediately to the king, her hands trembling slightly as she explained what she had found. "The Northern Watch Captain," the king repeated slowly, his expression hardening into something dangerous. "The same man who led the investigation into my own ambush. The same man who reported finding evidence pointing toward the Ashgrove family. If he was paid for his silence," Alira said, "then perhaps the evidence pointing toward the Ashgrove family was never accidental. Perhaps it was planted deliberately, to steer the investigation away from the truth." The king's jaw tightened, understanding dawning across his features, along with something colder, sharper, the look of a ruler recognizing betrayal, woven far deeper into his own court than he had ever suspected. "Then it's time we brought the Northern Watch Captain in for questioning himself, before Lord Vale can warn him that his silence has already been discovered." The Northern Watch Captain, a broad-shouldered man named Garrett, who had served the palace for over a decade, was brought quietly into a private chamber for questioning that same afternoon. Alira watched from a corner of the room alongside Dessa, the ledger she had discovered resting on the table between the king and the captain like an unspoken accusation. "I want the truth," the king said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "This ledger records a payment made to you, dated 2 days before my ambush, for your silence. Explain it to me now, and I promise your honesty will be weighed fairly. Continue lying, and you will find no such mercy." Garrett's composure cracked slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the ledger. "I didn't know they intended to kill you," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "Lord Vale approached me months ago, offering payment to look the other way, regarding certain trade route irregularities, benefiting his family. I accepted, thinking it a minor matter. I didn't know it would lead to this." "But you knew about the ambush," the king pressed. "You knew, and you deliberately misdirected the investigation toward the Ashgrove family." Garrett's shoulders slumped, defeat settling over his features. "Lord Vale came to me again after the ambush, panicked, insisting I plant evidence, suggesting Ashgrove involvement. He threatened to expose my earlier corruption if I refused. I had no good choice left by that point, Your Majesty. I am not proud of what I did, but I did not orchestrate the attack itself. I only helped hide the truth afterward." "Where is Lord Vale now?" the king asked. "I don't know," Garrett said. "He never told me his plans beyond ensuring my silence. I swear that on my life." The king studied him for a long moment, weighing the truth of his words, before finally turning to the guards stationed near the door. "Take him into custody. His fate will be decided once this matter is fully resolved, but his cooperation today will be remembered in his favor." As Garrett was led away, the king turned to Alira, his expression grim but resolved. "We know now that Lord Vale acted alone, or at least without support from the Ashgrove family. That narrows our search considerably, but it doesn't tell us where he's hiding, or what he intends to do next." "Perhaps he intends to try again," Alira said quietly, voicing the fear that had been building in her chest since discovering the ledger. "If poison failed twice, he may attempt something more direct." "That's precisely what worries me," the king admitted. "A cornered man with nothing left to lose becomes far more dangerous than one still playing careful political games." Over the following days, the search for Lord Vale intensified, guards questioning merchants and travelers throughout the surrounding territories, while Alira continued assisting wherever her knowledge proved useful. The palace remained tense throughout the search, guards doubled at every entrance, the king's meals now tasted by 3 separate attendants, before ever reaching his table. It was Dessa who finally uncovered the lead that broke the search open, having remembered a small estate Lord Vale's family owned in the hills just beyond the city, rarely used and easily overlooked amid the more obvious searches of his primary residence and known allies. "It's worth investigating," Dessa said, presenting the information to the king during a hastily called meeting. It's remote enough that he might believe it overlooked entirely. The king moved quickly, assembling a small group of trusted guards to investigate the estate under cover of darkness, careful to avoid alerting Lord Vale should he indeed be hiding there. Elira insisted on joining the group, her knowledge of poisons potentially valuable should Lord Vale attempt any further tricks, though the king initially resisted the idea of bringing her into potential danger. If he has more of that poison prepared, I may be the only one able to recognize it quickly enough to prevent further harm. Reluctantly, the king agreed, and the small group set out that evening toward the remote estate nestled quietly in the hills beyond the city. They arrived under cover of darkness, guards spreading quietly around the perimeter, while the king and a small trusted contingent, including Elira, approached the main entrance. Inside, they found Lord Vale, exactly where Dessa had predicted, gathering documents and valuables in obvious preparation for further flight. He turned sharply as they entered, his expression shifting rapidly from surprise to cold resignation, as he recognized the futility of resistance against armed guards surrounding every exit. "It seems my time has run out," Lord Vale said, setting down the papers he had been gathering with surprising calm. "Why?" the king asked simply, his voice carrying more genuine confusion than anger in that moment. "You had position, influence, a secure future for your family, through your niece's proposed marriage. Why risk everything through treason and assassination?" Lord Vale's expression twisted into something bitter. "Because a proposed marriage grants influence, Your Majesty, not power. My family has served this kingdom faithfully for generations, always advising, always arranging, never truly ruling. I grew tired of watching lesser men inherit thrones through birth alone, while families like mine remained forever in the shadows, no matter how capable we proved ourselves. So you decided the throne itself should belong to your family instead," the king said, understanding settling coldly across his features. "My niece's children would have ruled eventually, through marriage, through careful patience," Lord Vale said. "Until this healer arrived and complicated everything with her unplanned bond, I saw an opportunity slipping away, and I acted to reclaim it. By trying to kill me," the king said flatly. "By trying to ensure my family's rightful place," Lord Vale corrected, though the distinction felt hollow, even as he spoke it. "I take no pleasure in what I attempted, Your Majesty, but ambition rarely allows for comfortable choices." The guards moved forward to restrain him, Lord Vale offering no further resistance as his ambitions collapsed entirely around him. As they led him away toward the transport that would carry him back to the palace for formal judgment, Elira found herself studying his defeated posture with a strange mixture of relief and unexpected sadness, understanding now the desperate ambition that had driven a man to attempt murder rather than accept the slower, more patient path his family had followed for generations. "It's over," the king said quietly, standing beside her as the guards secured Lord Vale for the journey back. "Is it?" Elira asked. "There will be a trial, consequences, perhaps unrest among his allies within the council." "There will be," the king agreed, "but the greatest danger has passed. No more poisoned meals, no more ambushes hiding in wait along quiet roads. We can finally begin to breathe again, even if the work ahead remains considerable." They rode back toward the palace together, beneath a sky just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the weight of weeks of danger and uncertainty finally beginning to lift from both their shoulders, replaced slowly by something that felt, for the first time since Elira's arrival at the palace, genuinely hopeful. Lord Vale's trial took place 3 weeks later, held before the full council with representatives from noble houses throughout the kingdom in attendance. The evidence against him proved overwhelming. The ledger Elira had discovered combined with Garrett's testimony and the confiscated merchant's confession, leaving no room for doubt regarding his guilt. He was stripped of his title and lands, his family's influence reduced significantly, though the king showed a measure of mercy in sparing him the harshest possible punishment, choosing instead permanent exile from the kingdom's borders. "Mercy serves this kingdom better than vengeance," the king explained to Elira afterward, as they walked together through the same quiet garden courtyard, where their earliest conversations had taken place. "Though I understand if you feel he deserved harsher consequences after everything he attempted. I feel relieved that it's finished," Elira said honestly. "Whatever punishment feels appropriate, I'm simply grateful no one else has to suffer because of his ambitions." With Lord Vale's threat finally resolved, the council turned its attention back toward the matter that had started this entire chain of events. The bond thread still connecting Alira and the king, now fully formed according to the physician's final examination, using the resonance stone. The golden light within the stone had grown steady and strong during their most recent testing, no longer flickering uncertainly, but glowing with clear, unwavering warmth. The bond is complete, Corwin had confirmed during that final examination, setting the stone down with a note of genuine wonder in his voice. Fully formed, strong, and by every measure I possess, entirely healthy for both parties involved. The council, having witnessed Lord Vale's downfall, and the clear devotion the king had shown toward defending Alira throughout the entire ordeal, offered considerably less resistance than it once had toward acknowledging the bond formally. Even the sharp-eyed woman who had questioned Alira so critically during her first appearance before them had softened considerably, offering something close to an apology for the harsh treatment Alira had endured during those early, uncertain days. "We acted out of fear for the kingdom's stability," she explained. Fear, as it turns out, that Lord Vale exploited far more dangerously than any bond thread ever could have. The formal announcement came during a public ceremony, held in the same central courtyard, where the king had once defended Alira, before a divided, uncertain crowd. This time, the atmosphere felt entirely different, curiosity replaced by genuine celebration, as the king stood before his people, Alira beside him, and announced the bond between them, not as a complication to be managed, but as a partnership he intended to honor formally, through proper ceremony. "Many of you remember the rumors that once surrounded this healer," the king said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "Rumors, born from fear, and manipulated by ambition. I stand before you today, grateful that the truth prevailed. This woman saved my life not once, but twice. First through healing, and again through the knowledge that helped uncover the truth behind threats against this very throne." The crowd's response this time carried none of the earlier hesitation, cheers rising steadily as word spread through the gathered citizens about Alira's role in uncovering Lord Vale's treason. Alira felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the dramatic shift from suspicion to acceptance that had unfolded over the past weeks. In the months that followed, the healing house itself underwent significant reform under Alira and Dessa's combined guidance, with the king's full support. New protocols were established ensuring that no healer would ever again be left uninformed about which patients required urgent care, regardless of rank or status. Training expanded to include clearer guidance on recognizing dangerous situations, and a new system of communication between guards and healing staff ensured that fear or hesitation would never again delay treatment for someone in desperate need, as had so nearly cost the king his life on that very first night. "We nearly lost everything, because good healers were too frightened to do their jobs," Alira explained to a gathering of new apprentice healers, several months later, standing before them in the same healing house, where she had once arrived nervous and unbriefed. "Healing should never depend on knowing someone's title before deciding whether they deserve to live. It should depend only on the simple truth that every person bleeding in front of you deserves your very best effort, regardless of who they turn out to be." The apprentices listened intently, several taking notes, clearly absorbing lessons that would shape how they approached their own training in the months ahead. Dessa stood nearby, watching with quiet pride as the healing house she had served for decades transformed under new guidance into something stronger and more compassionate than it had ever been before. Later that evening, Alira found the king waiting for her in their private garden, the same quiet courtyard that had witnessed so many of their earliest, most vulnerable conversations. He smiled as she approached, reaching for her hand with the easy familiarity that had grown steadily between them over the months since Lord Vale's defeat. "The healing house reforms are progressing well," she told him, settling beside him on the stone bench beneath the familiar shade of the courtyard's largest tree. "I've heard," he said. "Dessa speaks of little else these days, quite proudly, I might add." Alira laughed softly, leaning her head against his shoulder as the last light of evening settled gently over the palace grounds. "It's strange, thinking back to that first night. I had no idea what I was walking into. No one told me which patient to avoid, which rules I was breaking, which danger I was stepping directly into the middle of. I'm grateful every day that no one told you," the king said quietly, pressing a gentle kiss against the top of her head. "If they had, I might not be here at all, and neither of us would have found whatever this is that's grown between us since. Whatever this is, Alira repeated softly, smiling into the growing darkness, feels like exactly where I'm meant to be. They sat together in comfortable silence, as evening deepened into night, the bond between them steady and unshaken, after everything they had faced, a quiet testament to the simple truth that sometimes the most important connections in life begin, not through careful planning or calculated arrangement, but through a single moment of instinct, courage, and the willingness to help a stranger in need, regardless of the unknown dangers that choice might carry.